Besides showing a list of resources, you normally want to interact with a REST resource in a couple of standard ways. You want to be able to create a resource, update one, delete one, or show a resource. And that is what we'll do in this video. Since these actions are so common, Laravel has a convenient way to define resource routes for you. You can define a resource route, and in your controller it expects a couple of actions or methods, which will map onto the routes that Laravel generates for you. Now, for a regular web application, you also need pages for forms to create a resource or edit a resource. Now, for APIs, we don't need these routes. For this, Laravel has API resources. We can define an API resource in a routes file, and we'll get the routes that we need to manage our resource. So let's copy this line into our routes file. Instead of the line we had here, we are going to manage our tasks resource, and they need to end up in our task controller. Now, we don't want to expose routes to our application for which we don't have actions into our controller. So we're going to tell Laravel that we only need the index route and the show route for now to show the single resource. If we now head into our terminal and list the available routes using the route list command, we'll see that there's a route set up to show a single task resource, which ends up at the task controller and the show method. So let's add this method to our task controller. From this controller action, we want to return our single task resource. So we're going to use the task resource class that we created before, and notice that this is auto imported for me, so maybe you need to do that manually. And in this task resource, we're gonna pass the task, and we're gonna make use of Laravel's route model binding to automatically inject the task model into our controller action. So in the URL that we're using, we're gonna use the task ID, and by using this type hint, Laravel understands that we want the model directly into our controller method here. So it automatically fetches it from the database for us. So let's save that and go back to our browser. And now if we're gonna change the URL and add the ID of the resource, which is 1, we'll see that we get the single resource returned. So before, notice the square brackets here on line 5. This is a list of resources, and this is a single resource. Now, if we go to a second one with ID 2, which doesn't exist in my database, we get a 404 not found error. This is correct because the model doesn't exist, so we want Laravel to return a 404 error. However, the client that will consume our REST API doesn't have any use for a HTML page when such an error occurs. We want to return JSON instead. Now, we get an HTML page because we make this request in a browser, so Laravel expects us to want HTML returned. Now in this case we don't want that, and we actually need to make this request in Postman. So in here I will first add a new variable for the domain that we're using, which in my case is HTTP localhost, and I run on port 8000. And I'll create a new request to show the resource. It's going to be a HTTP GET request. Use the domain or the variable that we just created and the request has the route API tasks and ID of 2 to show the 404 error. Now to tell Laravel that we want JSON returned, we need to add a header, the accept header, with the value of application JSON. If we now send this request, you'll see that we get a message back as JSON. Oops, that wasn't intended. Now there's a lot of information here, and this is due to the fact that in our env file, app debug is set to true. So in production, if you set this to false and send a request, you'll notice that you just get a simple error message and not all the details from the environment that we're running. Now I'll set this back to true for now, and also make a request to the resource that does exist, and you'll see that here we also get a nice JSON representation of our tasks resource. Hope to see you in the next video.